Alright, so we gotta talk about this latest One Punch Man chapter, chapter 211, and it's not for the reasons that you think. Yeah, this chapter was pretty good, I think, because it had some pretty insane reveals, and any chapter we get to see God in it, because we do get to see God in this chapter, I think is a good one. But I think more importantly than that, this chapter kind of reveals some concerns I've had with the manga in recent months. And maybe these are some things that have been worrying you too as you've been reading the manga and keeping up with even like the anime updates and stuff. So we're going to talk about that right after the chapter review, but we're going to go through the chapter first, kind of, have me give my quick thoughts on what I think of it and what I think it's implying, because it is one of those like heavier lore chapters. It's kind of building upon like the future final God arc, which is pretty awesome. But I'm not gonna lie, there are like one or two little things that I really don't like about this chapter, and maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you won't. I guess we'll see. But like I said, we do definitely have to have a talk about One Punch Man towards the end of this video. So let's just get through the chapter first. So if you guys remember in the previous chapter, we actually had a pretty big lore dump on like the history of Empty Void and Blast. We found out why Empty Void joined Blast in the first place. He kind of was trying to lie to Blast and tell him like, yeah, he wants to avenge his disciple that he had to kill because he had accepted God's power. But in reality, he just wanted to observe Blast's like unbelievable power for a little bit longer and maybe find a way to take it for himself and use it for the ninja village, for their ninja power, I guess. So he ends up joining Blast on his journey for the God Cubes, and along the way he actually has his younger sister Maya follow Blast more closely and get very close to him in order to get as much information from him as possible. And as we got to see in the last two chapters, it turns out that Maya is actually the person that ended up marrying Blast and having their son Blue. And in the previous chapter we found out that she had actually passed away because one of the avatars of God had actually sought her out and took her out. And we also got to see towards the end of the chapter that although ninjas are supposed to be, heartless and only be focused on the goal at hand, we did see that this, the death of Maya and the death of his disciple did seem to actually have a toll on Empty Void's mind, because towards the end when he was eventually reached out to by God, he had, looked very, what's the word I'm looking for, like gaunt, very exhausted. We saw at the very end of the chapter when he ended up being touched by one of the God Cubes that had fallen out of one of these like one-eyed statues that had shattered right next to them. He ended up seeing this vision. He saw Maya, and he also saw his former disciple that he had to kill that were offering him power, obviously as kind of surrogates or avatars of God. It was him taking their image to try to convince him to take this power. It was obviously not actually Maya or his disciple. So this chapter actually picks up right from this moment, and before that, we get the awesome chapter cover of Saitama dressed up as Santa. Very awesome to see these, Saitama covers whenever, he's not even relevant in the chapter. And it is Christmas time, so it was a nice thing to see. But as we continue the sequence between Empty Void, Maya, and his disciple, whose name I can't remember right now for some reason, I am going to read verbatim how their conversation went, because I do think this part is pretty important to kind of understanding Empty Void as a character. But that being said, to be honest, these like new additions to Empty Void's character or his personality, honestly, I wasn't a very big fan of, and I'll tell you guys why towards the end of the chapter, because that is one of my complaints, but we'll get to that in a bit. Well, if we remember from the previous chapter, Maya had offered the cube to Empty Void and calling it their noble mission. Well, in this chapter, Empty Void is questioning that and he's saying, noble mission? What noble mission? And Empty Void's disciple responds by saying, the role of a ninja, more than that, their politics, is based on the premise of mistrust and division among humans. If all consciousness were fused into one, distrust and conflict would cease to exist. We are part of a grand plan to make such a world a reality. Haven't you ever questioned it, elder brother? This world, filled with nothing but distrust and conflict. Well, Empty Void kind of rebukes this by saying, or kind of gives his own excuse to not be convinced, I guess, when he says, doubts or ideals are unnecessary in a ninja. We simply analyze reality and always choose an optimal solution. Well, Maya responds by saying, well, this is reality, while holding up a cube, and Empty Void can't really argue to that. He's kind of just wondering or marveling at the cube. And then Maya extends her hand like God always does when he tries offering his power, and pretty much says like, join us in our mission to get rid of distrust and evil in the world. And before reaching for her hand, Empty Void says, a world without distrust or conflict. Could such a thing truly exist? But then after this moment, we get taken back to the present time where Blast and Empty Void are fighting. We then get confirmation that Blast pretty much saw everything that we saw, kind of going through the whole process of Empty Void meeting Blast and then eventually accepting God's power and more importantly why. And then the fight immediately picks back up again, and Empty Void says something that I think kind of alludes to this might, maybe being an incomplete chapter. Again, that's like one of my little complaints that I'm gonna make at the end of the video, but Empty Void ends up saying, "Blast, you bastard, so you knew about the scheme I had with my sister and I." And Blast just smirks and says to him, "And what's so surprising about that? I can see through lies." And this part I actually thought was pretty funny because Blast goes on to say, "I like strong people. Maya did too. That's all there is to it. Petty tricks and conspiracy are trivial matters." And with that line, I saw a lot of people in like the One Punch Man Reddit and like a lot of memes pretty much saying like, this is Blast saying, "I still hit though," or saying something like, "Oh, but your sister didn't have any complaints," like kind of being a chat about it, which I thought was pretty funny, to be honest. But what's really interesting about the end of this exchange is that Blast ends by saying that more importantly, there seems to be a pretty big reason why Empty Void wants to end this fight quickly and not let Blast leave alive. So Empty Void charges up this superpowered dash or whatever it is, and he goes straight for Blast. And as Empty Void starts throwing these barrage of punches at Blast, the narrator actually starts revealing like the entirety of what Empty Void's like actual grand plan is. And just before we go into that, if you guys enjoy the channel and enjoy this One Punch Man content that I cover every single time a chapter comes out, please make sure to subscribe and turn those notifications on if you enjoy the content. And more importantly than that, I just recently came out with merch for the very first time. I'm actually wearing one of the t-shirts right now if you guys want to see it. So here's the logo in the front. And if you got a quick look at the back, it has like some references to some of my favorite anime. I worked with an artist to make the design on the back, and I'm very proud with the way they came out. I also love the material of the shirts because like, although this is like a thicker, higher quality shirt, it's not like heavy. So, it rests nicely. I like to be cozy, and this is a very cozy shirt, so I appreciate that. But one thing I think that you guys are really gonna like is that if you go on the website, if you check the link that I have in my description below, there's actually a brand new design that just came out that has a couple of pretty funny One Punch Man references in the design, if you guys can catch it. So if you guys are One Punch Man fans, which, if you're watching this video, then I'm assuming you are, then make sure to check out that specific shirt because honestly, I really do think you guys are gonna love that design. But anyway, moving on. So the narrator starts saying, "Void had a secret plan. At that time, Void, who had absorbed the power that leaked from Garo, regained self-consciousness and made a decision. He would pretend to remain under God's control, defeat the heroes, and use the cube to increase the number of avatars as much as possible. And in the end, he would exchange his own life, to divide all of his power among them, the power that opposes God, that he took from Garo, and then use them to defeat God." And then we get this pretty awesome panel of a bunch of like demonic looking humans or humanoid looking figures kind of flying up towards God ready to fight him. And then for the final page, we actually see this very like menacing and kind of scary panel of Empty Void withering away or disintegrating, kind of assuming this is what God would do to him once he tried to betray him. And the ending line of the chapter says that that was his plan, meaning that it's probably not going to work. And honestly, that kind of goes into my first complaint about all this. I guess we might as well just go right into it. Honestly, I wasn't that big of a fan of how One and Murata kind of turned Empty Void into this like virtuous, like anti-hero almost. Like, sure, he seems evil, but his intentions are really good. Kind of like that classic shonen trope. Personally, this is my opinion. I feel like the manga versus the webcomic has like really watered down some of these characters in that sense. Like, for example, like just take Blast, for example. In the webcomic, there's a lot less we know about Blast, but even then, like the information we are given about Blast kind of paint him to be this like, almost like Metal Knight type character where he'll do whatever it takes in the name of justice, even if it seems like it's like an evil deed, from an observer, right? He seems much more pragmatic in the webcomic than he does the manga. Like in the manga, maybe this is because we're getting a lot more insight into him a lot earlier on, but Blast seems more like, he's doing these things for such like a virtuous reason. He's remaining in the shadows so he doesn't get anybody else in danger, things like that. And even more so with Empty Void, I feel like this like new plan that he decided on where he was gonna like fake being God's disciple and then use the power that he got from Garo that defied God to somehow get his disciples to be strong enough to end up defeating God themselves. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And for like a ninja that's supposed to be like an elite ninja, very cunning, very intelligent, I feel like maybe it's because he doesn't fully understand God's power like we do, like the readers, but I feel like it wasn't that strong of a plan, because like how would he know that that power would divide onto his disciples? Like sure, he could consume Garo's power, but that's just because it seems like only he can do that, you know? Like how could he assume his avatars or disciples, whatever, could do the same thing? And also, why would he think that the power that God had bestowed upon someone would be stronger than his own power, you know, be stronger than God's power? Like how did he think that that would even out? You know what I mean? I don't know. Again, maybe I'm like over analyzing this. Maybe the fact that Empty Void is one of like, you know, the newer characters to all this stuff. He's kind of new to all this like God information and all that. Like maybe he just wasn't fully aware of what God can do. Like pretty much just take your power like that and kill you on the spot. But then again, if he was traveling with Blast for like 15 years or however many years they were together, I feel like he would have picked up this information. You know what I mean? So I feel like that kind of debunks that whole excuse, because he's been with Blast for a super long time, or he was. So he should know about as much about God as Blast does, you know, at least close enough to it, right? And that kind of goes to my overall kind of complaint with some of these chapters lately, is I just feel like they're kind of strung together like they weren't planned, let's say, months in advance, or like they weren't really an initial idea by one. They were something that might have been like introduced by like Murata or editors or, you know, other people from the outside that are trying to kind of make this manga more like shonen tropey, you know what I mean? Like honestly, why can't we just get an evil character for the sake of being evil? Like maybe Empty Void, he was maybe like a more virtuous character in the beginning, maybe had some good intentions but was still pretty like pragmatic overall, and then he got corrupted by God and like that was it. Like the corruption didn't go away, or maybe like it was revealed that Empty Void had always been like this and God let him kind of like show his true self or something, you know, like just something. I feel like that would be more interesting than pretty much getting like a watered down version of Garo, because that's pretty much what Empty Void is being turned into, in my opinion at least. Like Garo had good intentions, he went about it in an evil way, much like Empty Void, and in the end he had those plans foiled, right? But he had kind of like a face turn at the very end. So I feel like this kind of the same thing that's happening with Empty Void. But I mean, obviously to me, Empty Void is way less interesting of a character than Garo is, and way less powerful even of a character that Garo is. So again, I just feel like this isn't like a very different type of villain than one that we just experienced with the Monster Association arc, at least in my opinion. Again, one big thing that I think many of you noticed when you first read this chapter is like, how did Blast get his arm back, number one? And how did Empty Void get his blade back? Number two, because we remember from the previous chapter, Saitama had took both of his dimensional blades, but like before that, Empty Void had cut off one of Blast's arms. What happened with what happened with that? Was that an illusion? Did Blast like graft his arm back onto his body somehow, and we're gonna get that explanation next chapter? So those are like two big inconsistencies that I saw from one chapter to another that I feel like I hope doesn't merit an entire redraw of the chapter, because that would kind of suck. But I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting. Let me know in the comments below if you guys caught that on first read as well.